Hey guys, welcome back to part two. Let's jump right into it. So part two, here's your big questions here. We're talking about involvement mostly into China and Japan. These countries also at a crossroads. So did the British really get China hooked on opium to steal access to trade ports? You think, wow, would they really do that? Turns out, yeah, they pretty much did. And we get a group of guys known as the Boxers who are going to start to question the ability of the Qing Dynasty to continue going on. And we're going to talk about how Japan got opened up. And we're going to learn why that school down in Sasebo is called MC Perry. So Chinese empire is under siege. We know the Europeans are going to start to move in and want to trade with China. And that's great. But what we're going to see is people don't want to pay retail prices for Chinese-made goods. They don't want to park their boat at the end of the dock, go in there with a handful of cash or some trade goods, and then fill up their boat and drive away and pay full price. So how do they get around that? Well, what happens if they were to just simply go in and start to control the means of production? What if they go in and take over the factories? And so one by one, these European powers are starting to push their way into local politics, local economies. Next thing you know, they're controlling means of production, and eventually they're going to control the access to to obtaining the resources to make the products that they want. And they're going to start control the whole thing. And they're basically just going to buy people off in order to allow them to do that. And now what you have is they're getting Chinese goods very, very cheap, and they're controlling the politics. And the Qing Dynasty, way up there in their fancy palace up in Beijing, is really powerless to stop them. And we're going to see the weaknesses of the Qing Dynasty come to fruition very, very quickly. The British East India Company, of course, they were in the opium trade. They control parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan where this particular flower grows, that you can extract parts of these flowers and these poppy flowers, whatever, and you can turn it into a very powerful, very highly addictive drug called opium. And opium was illegal in China. They didn't want it in their country. Well, Britain starts to sell opium in China. And China says, no, you can't do that. Well, the more China said no, the more that they sold it in there to get China hooked on opium. And they're making all kinds of money. And so they fight a war, and the British pretty much crush them and say, we're going to do this anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. However, we'll stop selling opium if you basically give us these ports and let us control all the trade in and out of these port cities. And China, the Qing Dynasty, really has no choice but to agree to this. And then 2 seconds later, Britain started turning around and selling more opium, even more than before. And they fight another set of wars, and they get even more ports. And we're going to see how they use this to basically force China into conceding these ports away from them by getting China hooked on opium. It's really kind of a brilliant tactic, but ultimately devastating to China. And so they ceded to the Treaty of Nanjing, basically gave up Hong Kong and a lot of other things, extraterritorial status. Britons could do pretty much everything they wanted to with diplomatic immunity, etc. And other countries are going to be given similar treaties. Germany's going to get in there, France, Spain's going to get in there in different port cities. Eventually, even Japan is going to have a port city in China. And so you can see these little spheres of influence controlled by some of these European countries. And remember now, Japan is cooking all the way up in here into East Asia, into Korea. They control a big chunk of Manchuria that they were ceded by the Russians in Manchuria. Remember, Russians just wanted this little territory to protect their rail line to Vladivostok, which they got, but they had to give Japan all of this, right? So Japan can control all this. There's a lot of agriculture up in here too. Remember, Japan doesn't have that much farmland. And they also have Korea. So Japan's starting to expand into this part of China, and they're going to eventually work their way all the way down to here, but that's another chapter. But you can see what's going on down here. The French start to get influence in Southeast Asia. They call it Indochina. And we're going to see British India all the way through here into Burma, all these guys. So you can see that the Europeans have a big old slice of the pie in Asia. And Japan is definitely starting their imperialistic tendencies all the way through. But here are these spheres of influence all the way through here. and we'll talk about the Boxers. So we got the Taiping Rebellion. We're going to see large-scale rebellions and the discontent of the Chinese peasantry, especially because of this opium. And now all of a sudden, prices of goods produced are going way down because they no longer control the means of production. And we're going to see some rebellions all the way through during this time. And they want the Qing dynasty out because they've been there now since the Qing dynasty in 1700. So they've been there for a couple hundred years, and they want them out. And so you get this rebellion, and people really aren't satisfied. And it's not really going to go very far because they can put down these rebellions without too much trouble. What they want is abolition of private property. They want free public education. They want to prohibit foot binding. That's a process. We talked a little bit about that before. And they don't want concubines. In other words, free girlfriends for the elite, forced girlfriends for the elite. They want to get rid of all of that. But Nanjing is captured. They give it a go. However, they're able to contain them. And next thing you know, anybody who forced or was part of this rebellion is captured, and 100,000 of them are put to death. We start to see China learning at the base, Western learning for use, etc. We start to see a lot of traditions now because there's a lot of European influence, especially in these port cities now. Railroads start to come in, academies start to come in. We see Empress Dowager. Really, that's her title. Her husband died. Her husband was an emperor, and he died. And then her son wasn't old enough, so she stepped in, but then really kind of overcooked her grits and started to take power herself. And a lot of people didn't want a woman to be in charge of China. That's just the way it was in the day. And she really kind of took it upon herself. But eventually, her son would become in power. But you see these spheres of influence. We see France getting into Indochina, Great Britain into Burma, all these places, going to Japan, etc., and the spheres of influence in China. We start to see Europe and other foreign nations controlling a huge chunk of East Asia, and it's not going to go well for China. They're definitely in a downward tailspin at this point. And so they tried this 100 Days of Reform. They wanted to take a look at their Confucianist roots for some changes to the system. They wanted to go industrialize, try to make some money, get on the world scene, etc. And we start to see this Empress Dowager getting in conflict with the emperor, etc. And who's really in power, and nobody knows, and it's not going to work out so good. And what we see now is a new group of people known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. It sounds like a bad Bruce Lee movie. But in the West, they simply refer to these guys as Boxers. And they want to get all the Europeans out. And so they start doing some guerrilla warfare, and they blow up some things. And the Qing dynasty really has to stay neutral because they can't afford to torque off all the Europeans. But they don't want these Boxers to take power because they're coming after them next. And so they really don't do anything during this situation. And it's really too bad. But what we see is eventually the European forces are going to take care of these Boxers for the Qing dynasty. And it's only going to be worse for the Qing dynasty after that, because now you got foreign troops all up and down your port cities to protect the interests that the Boxers proved vulnerable during this whole rebellion. So we'll watch this video in class about the Boxer Rebellion. It's 4 or 5 minutes long. It's pretty good. Watch it yourself if you want. But then Sushi, she dies. Mysterious sudden death. It's kind of funny how that all worked out. And her 2-year-old Pu Yi placed on the throne. And of course, people say that ain't going to work out. And the Qing dynasty comes to an end in 1912. And we're going to see another guy step up. I don't think we get into that. Another guy step up that wants to form a republic, Sun Yat-sen, and wants to form a Chinese republic. And they come awfully close, but then some things happen, and we'll get into that later on. We'll see how Japan starts to reform in the early 19th century. Of course, we got a lot of high taxes, agricultural output, population has increased. farmland has not. And so we start to see really a shift in the Tokugawa shogunate. This is trying to keep everything together. They owe the samurai a bunch of money. They got merchant guilds problems. They got all kinds of different things, and they're really having a hard time holding it all together because they've been isolated for 200 years, and now things aren't going so good. And then what we see is the Americans show up and say, "Hey, we want to trade with you." Right? Well, we know that in Japan during this age of the Tokugawa isolation, any foreigner set foot on Japanese soil, it's immediate death sentence, no trial, no jury, no nothing. And so the Japanese say, no, take a hike. Well, then Matthew Perry, MC Perry, comes back a little while later with 11 gunboats and says, oh, yeah, we're going to trade with you, and that's just the way it's going to be. However, the Japanese had a change of heart and let the Americans come on in and start to trade with the Americans. And then eventually Europeans are going to get into piece of the action too. But Japan's going to be very resistant to it. They don't want to see the same sort of thing happen in Japan that's happening in China with these spheres of influence. And so they're very weary about it. And they're very suspicious. And what we see is instead of the Tokugawa, warlords as the ones with the power, now because of all this trade, we see the big city merchants are the ones that are going to start to emerge as the movers and the shakers in this rapid westernization and industrialization, and the Tokugawa elites on the countryside are really going to become irrelevant to the big money merchants who side with the emperor. And what we see is kind of a reemergence of the power of the emperor during this time, and that's known as the Meiji Restoration. Emperor Mutsuhito takes power and really says we want to learn Western technology so we can use it for our own interest. And you put all that together with rapid industrialization and a huge influx of cash because there's no spheres of influence. Japan's making profit on all that stuff. All of a sudden they're rich and they're powerful and they're westernized with new technology. And they start taking a look over to Snowbank going, man, China's in no place to stop us. Russia's in no place to stop us. Korea's got really nothing going on here. The Philippines just went through a battle with Spain, so they're disorganized. And France owns Southeast Asia. Who's going to stop us if we want to imperialize, just like the rest of the world is doing? We want to take colonies just like France is and England is and Spain and Germany and Italy and all these guys. Who's going to stop us? There's nobody. And so Japan starts to colonize and do it very effectively, very quickly. We do get some influences, some social order travel to Europe. Wants to kind of change the government during this time. And privileges for these old school leaders like the samurai and the daimyo are now removed. And we're going to see a samurai rebellion crushed by the National Army. If you've ever seen the movie Last Samurai, it's kind of a historical reference to that whole clash, Tom Cruise, whatever. And we start to see a little bit of tax reform during this time. By 1889, we get a constitution, but not too many people are voting. We start to see literacy rates go up dramatically. And so financing cliques start to develop with private investors. And we're going to start to see some reforms to this rapid industrialization. And so did they really get China hooked on opium? Yeah, they sure did. No doubt. The Boxer Rebellion was really the reaction to the weakness of the Qing dynasty to not stop all these countries from gaining these spheres of influence. And they're going to start attack the Europeans without the help of the Qing dynasty. And the Qing kind of stays out of it. And eventually Europeans are going to crush these guys. And then the Qing dynasty is all but done after that. And then Japan gets opened up. The Americans just showed up with the gunboats and said, we're in. And Japan's like, well, we don't have much of a choice. And so they were desperate and they had no choice. But a lot of people really kind of fought back. But Japan westernized, industrialized, and monetized very, very quickly. And in that process realized that, why not go on the imperial track? And they did. And they did pretty good for quite a long time. So there you go. Thanks for playing. Where are we at here? That was 31. Look forward to seeing you in 32. There it is. Thanks, guys.